Thank you very much. And let's see if I can do what I'm supposed to do. Is that right?
That looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm actually a rangeland ecologist, and I'm not too sure what that means either. So I mostly work on landscapes that have native plants that are mostly used for livestock, but not entirely, depending on where you are. I mostly work in the Great Plains, but I do work all over the world. The topic I was given was really broad, and I debated what to talk about, and I decided that I was going to focus in on some of the topics that were in the headlines lately. Specifically, can we plant trees and get out of climate change related issues? And then also, can we magically graze cows and make carbon magically grow into the soil? And then, of course, nested in all of that are things like fire effects and fire patterns. And so I started trying, and in fact, on the media, you can find everything from cows will save the world to cows are the most evil, to trees will save the world to trees are the most evil. So I thought I would try to present and show a little bit of the complexity behind some of these topics. And so I started out thinking that I would build off of a project that I had some years ago that actually asked, how should we do conservation on rangelands or grasslands, if you prefer, but rangelands is a little broader than just grassland. And so as part of that project, I started out by suggesting that we needed to even understand how grasslands worked in the past or rangelands, and then talk about the current, and then we can talk about the future. So I'll use that here just briefly to make a few major points. So if you think about landscapes prior to European settlement, say 1491, you had a climate that was suited for grassland or rangeland setting, obviously. And then you had three primary drivers: fire, wild herbivores, and humans and other predators. And that's not to say humans are only predators. So there's obviously a lot more going on there. But to try and keep this fairly simple, those interacted to create a really complex landscape with varied structure. It's all native plants, but their structure was variable depending upon these things. If you compare that to current or contemporary landscapes, we've basically, in all but the Flint Hills, we've basically gotten rid of or tried to get rid of fire. And we've largely replaced it with fossil fuels. Fences, chemicals, trucks, those sort of things are sort of moving animals, whereas fire would have done it historically. We've largely replaced most of the wild herbivores, which were very diverse, with mostly domestic cattle in the Great Plains. There's some exceptions. And then we've either gotten rid of predators or greatly simplified them and limited their impact. So the only reason I bring this up is because these landscapes, particularly in the Great Plains, are dependent upon climate, but they're also dependent upon grazing patterns, fire, and those sorts of things, which make them interesting from a climate change standpoint, but it also makes them challenging. And so I bring up fire, and I'm not only going to talk about fire, but fire sort of runs through this for one obvious reason. It should be clear by the time I'm finished. But if you look at our landscapes and you think about the kinds of fire that occurred there historically, this is a map that's an estimate based on fuel chemistry, climate, and some tree ring data, sort of recreating maybe how frequent fires would have been historically. So, I started my work down in Texas, where it's less than a 2-year fire return interval on many of those sites. Most of the plains is less than 10 years and certainly less than 20 years between fires. And we've largely modified that. And in fact, arguably, it's led to lots of changes in the landscape, but I'll talk more about that in a second. I think the realistic question that is in the media these days has value, but what if we limited fire and promoted trees and grasslands? And I'll try and talk about that today. What would the future look like? And alternatively, should we consider things like fire and grazing as a better part of climate change mitigation and adaptation? Not just suppression, but how should they occur? So that's what I hope to talk about. And just as some background information, if we did suppress fire, there's pretty good data out there. And this is even a fairly old study, although it hurts me to call 2000 old, but where if you suppress fire, where you allow moderate fire frequency versus high fire frequency, how much total carbon is in the ecosystem, and you definitely get more. But there's actually more to this, and that ought to be the motto of my entire talk, is that there's more to it than that, and there almost always is. If you break out where the carbon comes from in the system, the take home of all these graphs is that most of it there is more carbon, but most of it is above ground. The exception are these really large coarse roots. But if you look at these high axis, the scale of the axes are different. So the main two are the A and C. And this is tree total carbon, which has more if they're suppressed, whereas the soil and fine root carbon is much more similar. So I think it's pretty clear that you can grow trees in a grassland, increase carbon that's captured, and it might make people happier if it were in the soil, because then if the fire does come, you're less likely to lose it. But nonetheless, that is a real possibility. There is something to the fact that you can increase carbon within a woodland ecosystem versus a grassland. But that comes with a lot of cost, and I want to talk about those, and all of these costs have trade-offs, and that's what I want to do for the rest of this discussion here. So the first main point I want to make when we ask what would it look like is that really we've already been doing this for the last 100 years, except for in the Flint Hills. And so in some ways we can actually say, well, at least somewhat, we can use what's happened over the last 100 years to understand what would happen if we go ahead and promote it. This is a map showing fire activity in the US, and the Flint Hills sort of pop out. There's some other spots, of interest, and some of these are big wildfires, and some are like the one in southwest Oklahoma is the Wichita Mountains, and the military base in the southwest part of the state. So the bottom line is that in the US, compared to other continents, we've largely successfully suppressed fire on many, even though you hear a lot in the media about it, and there are some extreme wildfires, and they are increasing. We've largely done a fairly good job of suppressing fires, certainly for the last 100 years, although they're increasing, so we're getting less successful. And in fact, 3/4 of the US land dominated by native vegetation has been shown to be moderate or highly departed from reference conditions as a result of altered fire. So that means a lot of land has already changed and will continue to change. And that has far-reaching implications to land use, but it also has implications to things like biodiversity. A lot of what I work on lately is sort of at the interface of climate change and biodiversity, which is another sort of global change challenge. So within the plains, the one thing that we see when we stop fires and allow woody plants to grow is we do see an increase in woody plants. And that leads to changes in lots of different things that I'll talk about in a second. But let me just point out, this is a recent study from a former postdoc of mine, Reinhard Schultz, and he demonstrated that across the entire Great Plains, you can actually support about as much as 25% woody cover to the far west, and as much as 60% woody cover across most all of the Great Plains. That's almost as much woody or tree cover as you have in the deciduous forest in the southeast, at least in some places. So the point, the whole Great Plains can support more woody plants than they already do, which could lead to more carbon sequestration, but it also comes with some trade-offs. Also, if you ask this is an analysis of the ecological site descriptions. This was done by a former postdoc of mine that's now at Lincoln, Nebraska, Drac Twidwell. And Drac went through all of the ecological site descriptions based on expert opinion, and they identified the primary causes of ecosystem changes that were occurring across these landscapes. This even included climate. And it's interesting how climate is handled in those, but that's almost a different topic. The main point is that woody plant increase, or the desire to reduce woody plants, was the primary change that was outlined by expert opinion in all rangelands of North America. So the point is that woody plants are increasing, and they have the potential to increase even more, and they've been increasing. In the Great Plains, that increase started in the south and the east and is spreading to the north and west. And if you live in a region that doesn't have a major increase in woody plants, just give it some time. Eventually, you probably will, and that comes with a lot of changes. So what changes when you do have an increase in woody plants? First thing, our first point is livestock production, as much of the Great Plains, certainly on rangelands, is dependent upon livestock production. And I'll use an example. You can sort of look back in time by looking south, because the changes that are occurring, say, in Oklahoma and Kansas now already occurred in Texas, and they're starting in Nebraska. So what's happened is, this is a long-term data set from the Sonora Experiment Station, which is the southwestern edge of the Great Plains. And it shows a 6-fold decline in the amount of livestock that can be carried. So there's a lot in this graph, and I can talk about it all day, and I know you don't want to. The most important point is early on, it was controlled by animal scientists, and they were clearly focused on the animals. And then range people took over, and so the experts are there. But you see that it leveled off for a while, but then it continued to decline. So what happened? Well, we went from 10% woody cover to 50% woody cover, while the animal scientists focused on the animals and the range people focused on the grass. The grass was going away. And this is occurring all the way as we move up the plains. It's just at different stages in that. And essentially, in that region around Sonora, Texas, livestock is becoming secondary to managing wildlife. I was just down there last week. And then here's Stillwater, Oklahoma, and this is economics from livestock production. And you see pasture 1 and pasture 2. Pasture 2 goes to essentially 0. So what's the difference? Well, pasture 1 was burned with prescribed fire. So it has consequences, but it is able to maintain $10 to $20 per acre economic income. So one of the projects related to livestock that I'm a part of is ongoing right now, and we called it the Prairie Project. It includes Texas A&M, Oklahoma, and Nebraska Lincoln, and the areas from Nebraska down to Texas. And the main question is, how do we have rural economies, heterogeneity for ecosystem services, which is something else I work on a lot, and then simultaneously limit the greatest threat to grassy biomes. So that is coming out in the literature, that the loss of global biomes that are grass dominated, whether it be a savanna or a grassland, is largely, mostly driven by woody plant encroachment, and probably at higher rates than any other biome in the world, certainly competing. So we argue there's two options. One is that you've got to use fire, and we use this Pyric herbivory, which is basically the interaction of fire and grazing. The second one is that you can find some alternatives if people are willing to consider different livestock species. And that is heresy in the Great Plains, but it actually, and it's interesting to talk about from a social science standpoint, but people really don't want to do that. And in most of the plains, they don't want to do either one of these things. I'll talk more about that in a second. If you aren't interested in livestock production or the economics, the traditional economics of the region, then you might be interested in endangered species, and there are several in the state or in the region that are dependent upon these grassy biomes. Sort of a poster child are the prairie chickens. Lesser has been listed, and then it was delisted, and I think they're going to list it again, although that decision hasn't been made yet. And when you look at its historical range by the gold outline, a lot of people focused on the cultivation that occurred. I mean, this species occurred all the way down almost to Mexico. I don't know if any of y'all driven through West Texas, but there are no prairies. And this species can only tolerate, or it cannot tolerate one tree per hectare or per acre. So essentially, very few trees in this species is around. Well, that whole southern 2/3 of that distribution is now woodland. So essentially, the range was historically lost to cultivation, but now it's more the expansion of trees. And so the argument that we put forth is that when you're trying to prioritize conservations and the conservation in an area, and you're interested in biodiversity, the Great Plains is a good example of prairie chickens. And this seems insanely obvious, but it sometimes has to be. If you start with an intact landscape and then you fragment it, and that moves it to the right. And the primary fragmentation is cultivation and woodland. And it used to be cultivation, and now it's mostly woodland. Also energy development. Then prairies sort of follow the opposite trend. And the main point that we try to make is the government programs that help landowners often focus on how they can manage their individual parcel of land. Well, if you've moved from the left to the right, then the potential to actually have successful local management goes way down, and it becomes almost a worthless endeavor. So the efforts ought to focus on moving the entire region to the left, and then we can talk about doing the local management. Increased woody plants also affect other wildlife, and this is an example from an old study done at Oklahoma State, where grassland birds are highly sensitive to eastern red cedar cover. That's why they call them grassland birds. They like grasslands. And this is an example that's been used all over the country to talk about trees increasing and how we lose species. And this is important. Grassland birds are the most rapidly declining group of species in the world. So there's a lot of attention. How can we have grassland birds and deal with climate change and have agriculture and so forth? And I think this is a fair issue, but it's also an incomplete discussion. And so I actually currently have a student, Jennifer Knutson, and she's looking at these birds that decline like the previous, which are this top group of birds. as shown like the Western meadowlark. If you get trees, it's trees along the bottom. Then you up to 5%, you've lost most of the abundance of this bird. But what's missing from that discussion is that you gain a lot. And so it's this trade-off. So you lose some, you gain some. Now, the ones you gain, this analysis on the right shows where their peak abundance is. And so we still don't have a lot way out here on the right that would suggest lots of trees, but certainly some can respond positively to some woody plant encroachment, and that's a more comprehensive discussion. And then if you're interested only in economically important ones, this is northern Bobwhite quail, and these are 2 wildlife management areas, and this is Samantha, Cady. And her data shows that Bobwhite is very sensitive to woody plants on one of them, but not so much on the other wildlife management areas. And then the other point I want to make is that shrub cover, which are also woody plants, actually have a positive effect. So the point I also want to make is that not all trees are the same. And some shrubs may be able to sequester more carbon, but also provide some critical wildlife habitat. So in many cases, we way oversimplify this discussion by talking about trees versus grass. Another important issue that's talked about a lot is the water cycle. And this is a complex study, what effect the trees have on water. And I'll just say that I have 2 very close friends. Chris Zoe is one who works here, and Brad Wilcox is one who works in Texas. And they have found opposite findings that in still water, apparently trees can have a big effect on the water cycle. They can, it's mainly just that they use water year round. So in the winter, there's less water in the soil profile. In Texas, it gets more complex because they've tried to actually kill trees so that they'll have more water in Austin and San Antonio. And Brad has done a great job of studying that and illustrates that that is not likely to happen. So there's no doubt trees affect the water cycle. Whether it magically makes water appear in Austin, Texas is up for debate, and probably not likely. Similar is wildfire danger. So fires burn, grasslands burn. So grasslands burn a lot. They have fuel that is likely to burn, and when cedar comes in, it's harder to burn. And it actually sort of limits the amount of fire. But when you get in a drought and you have a fire like the Possum Kingdom picture there, grass doesn't make flame heights that high. Only trees do. And that's an impossible fire to fight. So it changes the dynamic and makes wildfires more dangerous, but it may not actually completely increase the number of fires. And there's some great studies that have looked at that, and it's a hot topic, and there's plenty of discussion about, well, is increased fire due to tree changes in fuels, or is it due to climate change? And of course, the answer is both. And this paper does a good job of sort of outlining some of the complexity. And as Dennis mentioned, human health is another avenue, and we've looked at a couple of aspects. As these ecosystems change, you do get an increase in cedar pollen, which can have a really serious impact. Estelle Levitin has done a great job of outlining some of this. She's from the University of Tulsa. But I will say grasslands also have pollen producing plants. They aren't as vicious as like the juniper that occurs in central Texas, but ragweed's pretty serious though. And I don't know whether ragweed pollen has gone down in correspondence with this, but that would be something worth knowing. The other one is disease vectors that Dennis also mentioned. And in fact, I have a paper coming out. Well, it's out, but it's accepted, but it hasn't been released yet. And with Bruce Snowden, looking at as grasslands get invaded with trees, the disease vectors, the species of ticks and mosquitoes that carry diseases also move into these landscapes. And so that's an important ecosystem service, I guess, or interaction with the public. So increased woody plants by itself, whether it's driven by fire or not, has a major impact on changes on these landscapes. Independent of that, and almost counter, is that we also may have increased wildfires if we try to promote trees and also along with climate change. And so are wildfires increasing, and are they partially caused by fire suppression? Well, the answer to the first question is yes. And this is work from Drac Twidwell in Nebraska and his team, where they basically looked at the data from long term in the Great Plains and found that large wildfires are increasing actually across the globe, but certainly in the Great Plains. Union of Concerned Scientists have also said the same thing. They mostly associate it with climate change, which is probably largely true, but there are also cases where there's been major changes in the kinds of fuels that occur across the landscapes. So I do think we have more frequent extreme fire events that are probably driven by climate change, but there is no doubt we poorly manage the fuels from a fire standpoint. And in fact, we've done some studies. This is a study looking at, can we manage grasslands to promote fire suppression, at least wildfire suppression, using prescribed fire and grazing. And long story short, this study shows that this is the orange line is fire only, and this is rate of spread, and this is months since the fire. Or if you allow fire to interact with grazing, you can actually have a longer impact at keeping it below this critical threshold of rate of spread. And wow, it's hard to stop a fire above this line. And so this is under extreme conditions. So in addition and separate from the increase in woody plants and the effects on biodiversity, there are other effects on biodiversity. Grasslands have this pattern driven by fire and grazing. And one of the things I've studied a lot is using Pyric herbivory, which is fire interacting with grazing, to create patterns that create more diversity. And I'll just give you a quick overview of that. So a lot of the things you hear promoted about grazing are focused on trying to get uniform and complete utilization moderately. Nothing is too heavily disturbed, nothing is undisturbed. And there's a lot of promotion of that through soil health. Unfortunately, biodiversity and historical grazing, as well as GPS on grazing animals, suggest that that's not exactly how it works. And in reality, what's really important is this heterogeneity or variability of standing biomass. And that's what drives biodiversity and ecosystem function on these landscapes. And it's the interaction of fire and grazing. Grazing animals have to be able to choose between burned areas and unburned areas. That makes their life happier, and it also makes the landscape better. And so an example, we have all these patches across the landscape, and grazing animals have full access to areas that are recently burned and very short, and areas that haven't been burned for several years. The probability of grazing is highest over here and lowest over here. Alternatively, the probability of fire is lowest here, and the probability of fire is highest here. So you've got this landscape, and it sort of, these patches shift around over years. The wildlife follow, the livestock follow, and the vegetation structure change. So some of the data we've collected, if we sort of look at this, look at breeding birds, different species require different locations. So you have to have the full array. Winter birds, it's the same. Small mammals, You have to have the full array, so you have to have fire on this landscape, creating heterogeneity in order to have a biodiversity. You got prairie chickens that respond to it. And then you've got some other things like nutrient availability, invertebrates, et cetera. So the point is that that's the way these ecosystems work. So we may not like fire from a climate change standpoint, but I think that's a critical thing for us to have to deal with because it's critical for the maintenance of these grasslands. And just a quick example, this is a picture of a burned prickly pear. But if you look, this bottom pad is not really a pad. That's actually a mountain plover, which is, has been listed. And it just sort of shows you how well adapted, this is a burned prickly pear, and how well adapted the species is to sort of look like a burned up prickly pear. So the more we study these systems, the more we realize that if we're going to maintain biodiversity on these landscapes, then we probably have to have some aspect of fire on the landscape. Are there alternatives though? And there are some, and that's largely what's been being done across most of the Great Plains other than the Flint Hills. Most of them are very carbon expensive, and that's why we didn't pick herbicides and heavy equipment, plus they're hard to make pay. The goats are will work, but they're a cultural no-no in the Great Plains. So, but we're working on them. And then a few final points before I make some conclusions. A lot of my focus on the Great Plains has changed recently, and I do spend more time thinking about energy development. And this is just an example from a former student of mine, Brady Allred, who's in Montana now, where he's looked at the impacts of ecosystem services lost to the oil and gas development on these landscapes. And the point is that some of these landscapes now look almost like they're, you know, they're industrial rather than, you know, native prairies. And what we found is that there's an enormous impact even on the agricultural productivity just from the loss of production associated with the change of the land. So that's not even counting the climate change impacts. So I was pleased to watch the talks today. Everyone's focused on the world as a socio-ecological world. The slowest in uptake in this is probably in the ecological community. And it seems like an advance to me to like realize, oh, there are people here and they actually matter. And I realize that's ridiculous, but I've spent my career mostly working in this green box. This is a socio-ecological framework built by Scott Collins. And then we modified it in the Wilcox paper to focus on woody plants and so forth. And so trying to develop an understanding, and I'm working with a lot of sociologists about why do people hate trees and why do people love trees and why do people kill all trees and why some people don't kill any trees and those sorts of questions. And it's just to sort of make one diversion here. I've developed a lot of ecological models that talk about how to maintain the grassland or how to maintain biodiversity in the Great Plains. And I sort of operated along this ecological gradient that you have to have a grassland. So in other words, yes, you're going to have a grassland over here, and no, you're not over here. Well, the thing I'm learning lately, and you all probably already knew, is that the social aspect of this may even be more important. So in the Flint Hills, there's lots of fire. So they want a grassland. So they're down here and they have the environment for a grassland. So they're in 4. There's a lot of the Great Plains that's on this side of the spectrum, but they don't have the social construct to do what the Great Plains what the Flint Hills has been doing. So I think the social part of that may be even more important actually. And then I'll just point out another, this issue of fire. From a social standpoint, working with DRAC, we developed this paper that's impressed, where we argue there's actually 4 eras of fire. It's the coexistence of fire with the indigenous populations. Then once Europeans got here, it was major suppression. And then at the same time, there was this sort of underground approach where people were saying we needed fire, but they were viewed as outcasts. And then we argue that now we've sort of moved into this wildfire era where it doesn't really matter what you want. We're going to have fire, and the fires are going to be difficult to deal with. Hopefully, I don't have to drag a dead cow behind the horse. And then I just want to make one more quick point, because as I developed this talk, I realized I didn't have enough time to really talk about the issue of, can you put more carbon in the soil with grazing? And I've been a part of a couple of efforts. This one's one of the most interesting because it includes scientists, but it also includes nonprofit people and ranchers and agency people as well, looking at, can we come up with a way, sort of like Alan Savory suggests, can we use this multi-paddock thing to put more carbon in the soil? The short answer is no. It seems like when it's fairly dry across the Great Plains, grazed areas have more soil organic carbon than ungrazed areas. So that's why the line's positive above 100 here. But it's not much of an effect, and there's no real type of management that's better than the other. It's just grazed versus ungrazed. When you actually look at the thing that's been promoted through TED Talks and television, it comes out at essentially no effect, which is what many other studies say about that practice as well. So to make some conclusions, so it's all about complex trade-offs. This is true about habitat for a lot of different species. There's nothing you can do on landscape. I shouldn't say nothing. There's very little you can do on landscapes that will not improve habitat for some species. But also almost everything you do destroys habitat for some species. So it really is trade-offs. The same is true with trees and agriculture production and carbon sequestration and water and those kinds of things. And the other point is it's so much more complex than trees versus no trees. So the things that have been hot in the media are sort of like, let's just plant a whole bunch of trees. And it's really, there's a lot more complexity to that. And the Great Plains actually has a lot of woody plants already. So it's not like it doesn't have to be either or. In my experience, there's actually tree planting policies in the same counties that there are tree killing policies, and that's even without throwing climate change in the mix. And it seems like it's counterproductive. I am learning a lot about social science, and I find it very fun, and it's exciting that there are a lot of people here that know a lot about it. So there's also a lot of remaining integrated questions that are hard to know how to deal with, but that are important. So how important is above ground and below ground carbon versus below ground carbon when we think about sequestration? Should we consider different strategies for different types of land? For example, grasslands don't fix more carbon than they're grazed if they've never been cultivated. But if they have been cultivated, then you can promote some kind of management that might put some of that carbon back. So that clear distinction needs to be made. There's almost no talk about landscape ecology that's critical for conservation, and it all leads to conservation triage. And I just want to end with a point. It's sort of an existential crisis to me. I've been reading a lot of books about how to deal with conservation in the future, and some of them most of them base a lot on technology. And I was sort of trained under the Alvo Leopold. So you try to use ecosystem services and you bond with an ecosystem so that you can get the services that you want from it by keeping all the parts intact and so forth. And it seems like we're kind of moving into a George Jetson realm, which maybe I'm the only one that's slow to the uptake, which if you're too young, George Jetson was a cartoon and they lived all the time sort of separated from the ecosystem. And I feel like the kinds of things that I've traditionally studied are going to be affected by climate change, but they aren't going to very well solve the problems associated with that. And with that, I hope I get some questions. Thank you.
Well, you certainly have gotten some questions. So note there is a poll that's popping up now, so do please fill that out for us. And I'll start with the Q&A and then run over to the chat. So Cynthia asks in the Q&A, for your comments on increased desertification of areas in the US, how would that impact historical habitats? And is this causing migration of native species?
Yeah, there are data that show that there are migrations, and there's concern that it's even causing mismatches in migrations between species that may be dependent upon each other, and they arrive in an area and resources aren't suited yet. So there's a lot of really serious challenges associated with conservation and the change in climate. And it's really hard on a lot of people on how to deal with that. And I'll just give you a quick example. Lesser prairie chicken, which I showed the distribution, and basically what goes up part of the way to, and it doesn't get to Nebraska. So it's in Kansas and Colorado. Well, where the population is doing the best is at the northern end of the range, and where it's doing the worst is at the southern end. And that's probably very climate change driven. So in reality, if you didn't care about politics, you would say we should be focused on moving that species further north. The problem is that once you list the species, then there are citizens in Nebraska that probably don't want it to be associated with being there because it's not there now. So, you know, why? And so it just creates a whole new political challenge. But it's true, when you look at the models at its lower and western distribution, the models suggest that that's going to be similar to the Mojave, you know, by 2080. So it's not going to be pretty prairie chicken habitat.
Okay, interesting. We have another question, and I'm going to, I think, just straight up read this one. We have increasing wooded areas, but those wooded areas could be softwood or hardwood trees. And, you know, more organic matter and water retention may create less of a fire spread. Softwoods do burn easier than hardwoods. So what type of balance of softwoods and hardwoods could exist, and is there a focus on increasing soil organic matter?
Yeah, well, it's mostly a debate. You know, I mean, the argument is you go to a tract of tallgrass prairie that has never been cultivated. It's really hard to find a soil that has more organic or more carbon in it than a grassland soil. So there's considerable debate. So if you have a sort of degraded site that isn't rich with carbon and you get trees that come in, then you'll certainly get an increase in carbon. And so it's a difficult distinction, because it certainly matters where, and there's a clear distinction in land that was historically cultivated and has lost a lot of carbon. Aside from that, the mixture, so on the eastern part of the Great Plains, there's some discussion about hardwoods versus softwoods and those sorts of discussions. As you get west, you're really talking about, it's not forested, it's sort of woodland, and that actually is very little value to the wood at all. And it's a mixture, because you have trees like mesquite trees that are hardwood, and then you also have juniper or cedar. So no one's really talking about the appropriate mix of the woody plant encroachment. It's sort of left right now with trees good, trees bad. And I think we need to actually do a little better job of teasing that out.
All right. So next question. Climate change increases that risk of prescribed fires. So how do we intentionally restore a fire culture when society is so risk averse to fire?
That's $1 million question. So the most, if that were your goal, so I mean, again, there are a lot of people that don't really want to do that, but there are a lot of people working on that. And there have been some successes of late. So the biggest success are the fire cooperatives that have been popping up. So where landowners help other landowners burn. And the real thing it does is it helps create a culture where all of a sudden you're not crazy if you do an appropriate prescribed burn, and there's even some peer pressure to make sure that you do it right. And there's pressure to make sure that you've got, nobody wants to come help you burn if you didn't manage your fuels appropriately, and it's going to be unsuccessful. So it creates somewhat of a culture, and those have been popping up into the Dakotas. So they sort of started in Texas, and so I suspect that they will become more important through time. Generally, that's the primary challenge, is that most people aren't, that we don't have a fire culture. And we essentially lost that with the indigenous populations that were here before.
Gotcha. Kathy had a question that was kind of already answered. So I'd like to make sure that it gets fully already answered.
Well, you mentioned the Flint Hills, and I live in the Flint Hills, and, every April, we all know what's going to happen with the prescribed burning. And with the tallgrass prairie, we all talk about, people get on board really quickly with, oh, there's an endangered bird, or there's an endangered mammal or salamander or things of that nature. But the tallgrass prairie ecosystem's endangered, and fire is what keeps it going. We have people here that, even though they've lived here for years, we're still educating them on why they burn. Not the ones that are burning, but like the general public, the ones that aren't ranchers or farmers. I mean, do you think that there's still, what's it going to look like in 40 years as these lands transfer ownership, or, people, is there still a danger of that getting to where we're not going to be burning as much here, and that culture keeps shifting, even though we still have a burn culture here to some degree?
I think that's a great question. And a quick story. I was part of a group that met in the Flint Hills to talk about the future of the Flint Hills from an agricultural and ecological perspective. And we were asked what the greatest threat was, and we were actually standing up on a hill in the Flint Hills when we were asked that. And my answer was, it's the changing culture. So it's the fact that a lot of that land is being owned by absentee landowners, and it's also being purchased. And this is happening throughout, on rangeland throughout the world. Really, rangelands are largely being purchased by people who just want them for recreation.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't, Boone Pickens, and I get a pay raise when I mention him on the state, but he has a ranch for sale that you can go look at. I think it's $250 million. And the whole thing was just set up for recreation. It's basically a quail hunting paradise with a golf course. But so there's, and if you talk to the realtors, they'll tell you that most of the land is being purchased by people who are not connected to agriculture anymore.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're not going to get involved when they get there, but it does mean that they don't necessarily have the same connection with it that the people did historically. And I think that is probably the greatest threat. I do think there are things ranchers could do. So like, there's good data now that they don't all have to burn on the same day.
Right.
And
spread it out a little bit.
Yeah, they could spread it out so that the people in Kansas City and Lincoln and Wichita don't get choked out, real bad.
Yeah.
But there's still some debate about that. A great question.
Okay, I've got one more question, and spoiler alert, it's my own. You mentioned that goats are a cultural no-no out your way, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because I'm sitting in a county whose goat show is about to eclipse the swine show.
Yeah.
So,
and it's changing here, but when I moved here from West Texas, where I worked on places that had goats forever, and I mentioned goats, and that was 25 years ago, and one of my mentors said, I don't believe I'd do that anymore if I were you. And I've done it. But it's taken 25 years. We actually have a study ongoing right now to look at woody plants and can we maintain grasslands with less fire, maybe not no fire, but less fire, and do it by making a more diverse livestock enterprise where we still are mostly cattle, but we've added some goats. So we don't want, but culturally, this is from the sociologists I've worked with, is the identity of many of the landowners in the Great Plains are cattle or cowboys, and it's hard to be a cowboy when you're holding a goat. And it sort of, you didn't see movies where John Wayne was driving a goat herd north or anything like that. So I just think that there's a big, long cultural switch, and it's progressed more rapidly in some places than others. And like the Flint Hill, it's curious. So I work at Sonora and the Flint Hill, Sonora, Texas, all goats. They think you're crazy if you light a match. And then you go to the Flint Hills, it's all fire, and they think you're crazy if you mention goats. And it's and there's exceptions in both cases, but it just sort of highlights how much it's dependent upon the social aspect.
The goat culture could get a foothold. I noticed in Dennis's talk about climate indicators, he mentioned kudzu. I'm from the South, and if you want to get rid of kudzu, you get goats.
Goats.
well, I believe, yes, that wraps up the questions that we have. Oh, nope, hold on. Oh, yes, okay. That does wrap up the questions that we have for you, Sam. We appreciate your time today and all the information that you shared.
Thank you. Thanks so much to everyone.